Dobrý večer. Ja som teda Martin Luterán, rektor kolegia Antonovita a budem pokračovať v angličtine, ak sa neurazíte. Dear Professor Finnis, dear Christian scholars, present and aspiring, dear friends, I still remember the moment when I first knocked on the door of Professor Finnis' office at the University College Oxford. I was then an Oxford student, master's student, applying for a research degree and hoping that Professor Finnis would supervise my thesis on euthanasia. I was scared then, and I'm similarly scared now. Perhaps scared is not the right word. I was awed, in a state of awe, knowing I will soon personally talk to a legend. I feel the same now, but today I can share this feeling with you. You can join me in knocking on the door of a brilliant scholar and learn from his wisdom. Wisdom that was forged during numerous decades of hard intellectual labor in law, philosophy, or theology, in a discussion with his masters, including surely St. Thomas Aquinas, colleagues and students, tested in dangerous public battles about the most topical moral and political issues such as abortion, understanding of marriage, euthanasia, immigration, etc., etc. And also wisdom formed by his Catholic faith, his life experience, his life of a husband and a father of 6 children and a grandfather of 14. John Finnis was born in Australia, where he earned his bachelor's degree in law. He won a Rhodes Scholarship in Oxford, where he obtained his doctorate of philosophy degree in 1962 under the supervision of famous H.L.A. Hart. It was in that time that he also converted and became Roman Catholic. He was lecturer, then reader, and then a chaired professor in law at the University of Oxford for over 4 decades until 2010, where he's now Professor Emeritus. A barrister of Gray's Inn, he practiced from 1979 to 1995 and was appointed Queen's Counsel in 2017. He's a fellow of the British Academy and an adjunct professor in the Notre Dame Department of Philosophy. He was at different times a member of the International Theological Commission of the Holy See, the Pontifical Council of Justice and Peace, and the Pontifical Academy Pro Vita. He's an author of many books and numerous essays. His main work on legal philosophy, natural law and natural rights, will be soon published in Slovak in the translation by Matúš Sitar in the Exempla Juris edition of the Calligram Publishing House, which is one of the reasons why he's here this week. The presentation of the soon-to-be published book will take place tomorrow at the law faculty of the Comenius University. The fear I felt when I first knocked on his door went away when I entered the room and met a true gentleman who made himself generously available to improve my thinking and writing. I often felt he knew better than I what I wanted to say, and he could express it more clearly and more precisely. I hope you will soon have a similar experience. Tonight, we will hear his thoughts on the role of Christian scholars today. Professor Finnis has been a Christian scholar for more than 50 years of his life. What a great blessing it is to hear tonight his views on what it means to be a Christian scholar, whether Christian faith hinders or helps the true scholarship, or what obstacles Christian scholars have to face today. I look forward to an inspiring and challenging lecture and to the follow-up discussion. So once again, please join me in welcoming Professor John Finnis.
Thank you very much, Martin. So, as Dr. Lutheran has told you, he didn't reveal that I was asked by you, to speak to you about the role of Christian scholars today. And that word today is a reminder to us all of time and change, and to me, it's a reminder also of the more than 30 years that have elapsed with much change since I first came to Bratislava as, with my eldest son, the generously hosted guests of Jan Czarnogórski. I was one of the philosophers from Oxford and elsewhere in Britain who, over a number of years, sent books and scholars to share ideas and scholarship in the underground university here. Animating the venture, perhaps more than anyone in Britain, was Roger Scruton, though I did not know that until I returned to the region a year or so after the events of late 1989, as one of a band of mostly British and French lawyers and theorists for a conference now not at all underground about the rule of law. It's a privilege for me to be here again, now for these Bratislava Hanus days, in a today that is almost as different in various respects from 1990-91 as it is different in quite other, more obvious ways from 1986. Scholars are dedicated to the search for information, to seeking to inform themselves about the physical or biological or metaphysical forms and processes of nature and reality, or about the conditions of coherent thought and valid reasoning, or about the conditions for reasonable choices of what to do, what human goods to pursue and do, or about what techniques of humanly controlled causes and effects are available as efficacious techniques for achieving some definite purpose available to be selected from the open-ended, indefinite range of ends available to us, or to inform themselves with greater or lesser specialization about all these fields of information, of truth, of knowledge, of the real and of the really worthwhile. Scholars raise and pursue questions suggested by the data of empirical experience. They assemble evidence, entertain hypotheses suggested by imagination, yielding to understanding, and after the testing of evidence and warrant, they head towards their goal, the making of judgments which they understand to be sound about what is so. The criteria of soundness and of the best explanation of all the data are, in principle, public criteria. And so, under ideal conditions, every open-minded person capable of experience and understanding, and thus of being informed, would concur in the judgment about the best explanation, and so would share the same knowledge, the same access to reality. The primary role of the scholar, therefore, is to cultivate what I have just recalled: attentiveness to evidence, willingness to follow the evidence and to judge according to the evidence and not according to one's prejudices or desires or fears or one's susceptibility to pressures, whether of ambition or public opinion or unpopularity or of mainstream academic opinion. What this involves in relation to one's motivations, I'm going to discuss in some detail near the end of this talk. For now, let me make a preliminary general point. All authentic scholarly endeavour requires that one reject in advance and constantly every assertion that truth is unavailable in human thought and discourse, and every assertion that the past is beyond the reach of true judgments about what was done, what was said, and what was intended and meant, and every philosophical doctrine or assertion that we are not psychologically free to choose between being honest and being dishonest about the evidence and its implications, to choose, that is to say, between being zealous or negligent about truth and reality and real worth. Every denial of the human freedom that is addressed by moral norms against that intimate, secret, but far-reaching kind of dishonesty and negligence. These are norms, they're ought propositions, that, like all moral norms, would be literally meaningless if there were no psychological freedom to violate them. Yet everyone knows in his heart that he has that freedom to choose to be dishonest or honest with himself or others. Every assertion of the kinds that I have just listed is not only incompatible with the role and vocation of scholarship, but also is irrational, because self-refuting, because in each case the assertion's content is falsified by the fact that it is being asserted and defended as warranted and true. Christian scholars are well placed to reject all those errors and to comply honestly, wholeheartedly, and completely with all these basic principles and norms of scholarship. The ruling secular materialist philosophy, on the other hand, leaves its adherents badly placed to do so, badly placed to sustain a life of scholarship. In particular, the soft determinism that prevails, at least in the world of English-speaking philosophy, treats freedom of choice as no more than a kind of sophisticated illusion that overlays and conceals, is compatible with the scientific truth that because there is no causality other than physical causality, there can in reality be no free choices. By free choice, I mean a choice that is real and that nothing determines which option I choose except the act of choosing itself. That is, except the free choice itself. But as natural reason more critically deployed makes clear, and divine revelation only confirms, the unique divine creator's choice to create a universe, and to create this universe in preference to the infinitely many alternatives, was an utterly free choice. And the freedom that we created persons have and can exercise to choose and to act on our choice is an image, a pale but very real imitation or imaging of that divine creative freedom and power. Thomas Aquinas follows the Eastern monk John of Damascus in saying that it is precisely by reason of this radical capacity we each have for free choices and mastery over our own actions that each of us can truly be called an image of God. This is an instance of a wider important truth. Christian doctrine means that Christian scholars are uniquely well placed to be good scholars, indeed to be the best of scholars. Christian doctrine articulates an account of reality and truth and knowledge, an account that in all eras, in some more efficaciously than in others, has favoured and enhanced scholarship and the pursuit of knowledge and science. But this synergy between Christian doctrine and scholarship and science has greatly increased during the 20th century. And the inherent comparative advantage of Christians over unbelievers in the pursuit of knowledge, science, and reality has only increased as materialism and Humean or Neo-Kantian or Nietzschean skepticisms and postmodernisms have flourished against and despite the increasing counter-evidence. Christian doctrine is above all an account, a true explanatory description of reality. It is information about reality. Indeed, it is an account in which information is central. And so, although its source and warrant is the supernatural divine revelation articulated in the scriptures and tradition of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, this account, this information, fits and supports and is confirmed by the 20th century's natural scientific discoveries about the primacy of information in, for example, biology, but also in the physics that has transformed our understanding of matter and of the universe. I explored these developments in some detail in 2014 in a lecture published twice in 2016, and today I shall say no more than this. Christian scholars, whatever their field, should become aware of and understand something about the multiple ways in which 20th and early 21st century natural science, especially cosmology, genetics, biology generally, and physics, including now nanophysics, confirms that the, so to say, cosmological positions reached by the Hebrew prophets in the 9th through the 2nd century BC were much nearer the truth than were the positions reached by the pre-Socratic or the Platonic, Aristotelian, and Stoic philosophical scholars of the 5th through 1st century BC. For the universe is not divine, as the Greeks, like almost everyone else, thought. The stars are not divinities. The universe is neither eternal nor cyclical. It begins not with chaos, nor with randomly moving atoms of matter, but with light energy and information. And matter is nothing but patterned process dominated by information. The universe is subject to the entropy described by the prophetic psalmist in Psalm 102 as its wearing out like a garment. But the universe also, now as from the beginning, is in process of transformation by new information, a process punctuated, so to speak, by steps up. New information not contained or in any way preformed in the preceding states of the universe enabled a world that for 10,000 million years had consisted exclusively of physical, atomic, and molecular dynamisms to evolve rather suddenly and rapidly into the unimaginably more complex, diverse, and self-directing the dynamisms, processes, and forms of living cells and organisms, eventually plants, and more consciously self-directing animals. That was a kind of step up in being, almost, or in some respects, as extraordinary, as miraculous as the initial Big Bang. And then after another 3,000 or 4,000 million years or so, creative information worked a third radical change in the constitution of the universe. There emerged one species of conscious animal able not only to receive and respond to information, like animals all do, and not only to deploy such information so as to manipulate the environment with even tools, but also and uniquely to understand at least some of that nature-constituting information and to reflect upon it and to consider accepting or rejecting it, and then to choose between those alternatives and indeed between countless other intelligent but incompatible proposals by free choices, choices that is determined by nothing either inside or outside the choosing person. And this third step up in being is defined most distinctly as, in non-philosophical terms, it is defined in the prophetic and historical parable we know as Genesis chapters 2 and 3. The ability of this newly emergent kind of Homo sapiens to communicate with and be informed in thoughts and words by the transcendent source of information, and to choose freely and on his or her own responsibility to comply with or defy the wise will of that Creator. And though none of these huge steps up in nature were preformed in the preceding state of nature, we can now see that those preceding states, right back to the beginning, were pre-adapted to the reception in due course of new creative information and the resultant emergence of the new and higher forms of natural entities and ways of being, eventually to the emergence and sustainability of humankind, man. This pre-adaptation of the entire cosmic process is often articulated in one formulation of the cosmological, one or another formulation of the cosmological anthropic principle. Christian scholars in the 13th century, for example, had none of that natural historical and natural scientific information which enables scholars today to contemplate the far-reaching extent of the Hebrew prophets' superiority in information and judgment over the greatest and most methodically rigorous of the Greek philosophers. But the 13th century Christian philosophers did decisively establish and secure the rational preconditions for the growth and success of natural scientific research, experimentation, discovery, and scholarship. They did this especially in face of the denials of natural philosophy by those Muslim scholars, the Mutakallimun, who held that the Creator's transcendent power works its effects in the world by willful divine decision, moment by moment, and independently of natural causalities, causalities which thus are more apparent than real or worthy of investigation. Thomas Aquinas refuted those scholars, along with those who imagined that divine creative activity began and ended with one tremendous initial creation of natural potentialities, which since then have been merely left to their own operations and the independent working out of their potentialities. Aquinas' reply, prominent in his great Summa for Christian missionaries in or around Muslim territories, affirms first that natural powers and operations and their effects do indeed constitute chains or sequences of causation which can fruitfully be investigated and understood by natural sciences and natural philosophy. And second, that all these natural effects and causes are themselves being caused here and now as much as at the beginning by the informing power of the intelligent designer. Bringing the two affirmations together in a powerful summary conclusion, Aquinas states that all these effects, all natural effects, are effects wholly of their natural causes and wholly of God, that is, of the transcendent, beyond nature cause whose actuality, intelligence, and intelligent will provide the only critical acceptable explanation both of nature's emergence from nothing and of the workings and evolution of nature ever since. To repeat, the entire universe of events and things is attributable not partly to divine power and partly to nature and natural causalities, but rather it must be attributed in whole to natural causes and in whole to God. And if you think about that philosophical proposition, you will be on the royal road to understanding what the word transcendent means and why we need it. And to understanding also that the Creator needed nothing to make the universe, is entirely outside and beyond it, and yet is inwardly present to everything as cause of all existing and operating, including of one's own acts of free choice, acts not determined by anything whatsoever except the choosing, one's own choosing itself. The developments of natural science in the past 200 years, especially but not only in biology, with its pervasive language of information and its pervasive evidence of evolutionary novelty and design, have rationally, though not socially, discredited Laplacian determinism, Spinozist and Nietzschean pantheisms, and atomist materialism, with its attempts to explain away the intelligibility of the universe's novelties and adaptations and continuities as mere matters of chance and necessity. The developments have made newly intelligible and attractive the Judeo-Christian realism that is the best seedbed and matrix for scholarship of every kind. True judgments attain to reality even when, by secure inference or abduction, they reach beyond what can be experienced. Moreover, the newly discovered plasticity of the cosmos and the proven radical dominance of information over the processes and potentialities we call matter make it obvious that the very same transcendent cause of the information which it is natural science's business to discover, of the information which adds biology to physics, can also be the source of those one-off changes in physics which were observed with amazement at various points during the public ministry of Jesus of Nazareth, during 2 or 3 years around 30 AD in Galilee and the Roman province of Judea, and then in his rising from among the dead into a radically transformed kind of physical biological existence. The Spinozist argument from natural determinism against miracles and the Humean argument against them from explanatory presumptions about the credibility of witnesses each collapse in the face of the new and established natural sciences of the 20th century. And above all, that vast new picture of cosmic evolution under the causal input of transcendent information makes newly intelligible two basic features of Christianity. Its teaching that each individual human person results from an individual act of divine creation, a creation, as Aquinas says, ex nihilo, and its even more important teaching that the whole of created nature has a direction, a finality in the sense of a destination that will be reached through a final input of creative information, this time by a cooperation between the free willing of the Creator and of created persons, a cooperation made possible only by a radically new kind of creative giving, a taking up of our created human natural existence into the transcendent life of the Creator. That is, we can now responsibly think that human persons, at least those consenting, can be taken up into that divine life while the rest of the universe that evolved by creative information over so many thousands of millions of years passes away by natural entropy and implosions, like the stars' implosions, into, we can only speculate, a kind of gas. For such is the meaning, now more not less intelligible, of the future about which Jesus spoke as the reign, the kingship, the kingdom of God, and of a new birth from above, and of which St. Paul too, who understood him well, speaking as a transformation and a metamorphosis from above into a new man, new nature, a new creation, and in the phrasing that Paul took from the book called Isaiah, a new heavens and new earth. St. Paul had in mind, I believe, not that the subpersonal elements of created nature as we know it by observation and natural history will continue or be transformed, but that human personal life with God, as children sharing his divine life, will, for those who accept that gift, be in unimaginable ways like living in a new world, and will be for God the completion and fulfillment of the whole vast event of creation, a fulfillment envisaged by him, God, from its initial moment, indeed from the eternity of his absolutely unchanging will and absolutely simple essence. In these and some other ways, this is therefore a good time to be a Christian scholar, and at the heart of the role of Christian scholars is and should be, both for its intrinsic worth and as part of that saving cooperation with the Creator, the intention of becoming and remaining scholars of the utmost integrity and competence, and each within their personal powers and opportunities, excellence. However, it is also an increasingly difficult time to be a Christian scholar. The cultures within which we move and pursue our scholarship increasingly misunderstand, misrepresent, and reject what they take, partly correctly and partly incorrectly, to be Christian doctrine, and increasingly judge or declare Christian scholars to be bigots whose intellectual work is unfree and therefore uncritical and unsound, if not contemptible. That in itself is not new. What is new is that within the worldwide Christian community, the community of communities that has as its central form the Church and Bishop of Rome, there now are very many prelates, clergy, and lay scholars in a condition of deepening confusion and intellectual disarray. And this condition has markedly deteriorated, worsened, since 1991, when I was last in these regions. And so I shall try on this occasion to say something about its symptoms, causes, and effects. And this attempt will, I hope, have the further benefit of enabling me to say something about what I have learned about communities of scholars during the many decades that I've been a student and professing member of the philosophical and juristic scholarly communities, and during my many fewer years as a visiting member of the Christian theological community in its Roman and international form, the International Theological Commission, chaired in those days, my days, by Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger. First, a word about the accusation that Christian scholars are not and cannot be intellectually free to follow evidence and argument where it leads, and therefore cannot be authentic scholars. Anyone who makes this accusation is simply presupposing that the Christian faith's teachings about reality are false, or at least without rational warrant. But Christian scholars can make all their scholarly investigations with freedom to follow evidence and argument wherever it leads, confident that, whatever the field, the conclusions from that evidence and argument will not contradict any proposition that belongs to the Christian faith in its authentic form. Many of the propositions, the teachings of the Christian faith, of course, are assented to only because they are revealed by God in that historical course of prophetic teachings, which after many centuries was concluded by the words and actions of Jesus of Nazareth, as heard and witnessed and eventually understood by his chosen messengers and their close associates, and recorded in the writings of those messengers, apostles, and close associates during the 35 years after he took his leave of them. But some of the revealed teachings are also teachings which those apostles and associates and the community they founded held out and hold out for assent on another additional basis, a basis that indeed is logically prior, a basis available to everyone who has the ability and opportunity to consider evidence and follow argument. These are the foundational teachings, three propositions especially, which the revealed teachings both include and presuppose: that God, the unique transcendent creator of the entire universe, exists, that he has revealed some main elements of his divine nature and of his purpose in creating, and that the content of that revelation can be securely found in what the Church, organized around the successors of the apostles and their leader Peter, holds out definitively as revealed. Those three foundational teachings are entirely open to natural reason, that is, to rational investigation of the evidence which is available to anyone and which supports them, that is, warrants the judgment of ordinary human reasons and reasoning that each of the three propositions is true. Christian scholars who have adhered to the faith without undertaking such a rational investigation are entirely free to undertake it. If they do undertake it, they need not and should not put their adherence to the faith in suspense, pending the investigation's completion, but rather should proceed in this scholarly undertaking, like all their scholarly enterprises, in free confidence that it will cohere with and indeed support the faith. Faith, this sort of propositional faith, is in fact the highest work of reason, a work that involves critical analysis of the alternative explanations that have been offered for the existence and nature of the universe, for the existence and literature of the seminal people, the Hebrew people, Israel, entrusted with divine revelation, and for the preaching and miraculous works of Jesus of Nazareth, as preached at the expense of their lives by his apostles and set down by them and their associates in the Gospels and other works of the New Testament. Until about 50 years ago, a Christian scholar in some field more or less remote from these philosophical, exegetical and historical inquiries into the foundations and warrants for the faith could peacefully presume that well-informed vindication of the existence of God, creation and revelation was a role entrusted to responsible scholars prepared and supported by the current successors of the apostles in the central Christian community. A primary cause, perhaps even the primary cause, of the disarray and precipitous decline and in various places near disappearance of that community is this, that presumption can no longer be made. Such responsible and competent scholars are not so easily found in that centrally Christian community. Very many of those successors of the apostles, very many among the community's bishops, from the topmost level down, have abandoned the preparation and support of such scholars, have ceased to expose their students for priesthood to such scholarly work, and have abandoned the teaching of the rational foundations of the faith. Indeed, they have in practice abandoned the teaching that Christian faith has rational foundations which, I repeat, warrant and even demonstrate those three foundational truths about, again, God's existence and creation of the universe, secondly, the historical fact of public revelation in Israel culminating in Jesus the Messiah, and three, about the location of the community that carries that revelation through history, along with the means and helps to fulfilling what it promises, eternal life with the Creator for all who desire to cooperate with him in bringing his work of creation to its fulfillment in eternity. The First Vatican Council in 1870, in its dogmatic constitution Dei Filius, emphatically confirmed and restated the teaching of St. Justin, the Samarian Roman philosopher in the 2nd century, St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, and Pope Pius IX in 1846, that those three rational pillars of the faith can be demonstrated by and to human, public, scholarly, critical reason. The Second Vatican Council in 1965, in its dogmatic constitution Dei Verbum on divine revelation, reaffirmed the demonstrability of the first pillar, God's existence and creation, and itself affirmed the essential premise for demonstrating the other two foundational pillars. For it affirmed, the Second Vatican Council affirmed in Dei Verbum 18 and 19, that all parts of all the four Gospels are historically trustworthy because authored, in two cases, by apostles who were first eyewitnesses and then ministers of the word, and who set down in writing their own memories of Jesus' words and deeds, and in the other cases by associates who handed on in writing the recollections of apostles or of others who had accompanied them. But even before that council came to its end, the mainstream, as you might call it, of Catholic New Testament scholars began to reject, or rather to ignore and defy without mentioning, those affirmations of Dei Verbum, especially what section 19 had treated as giving to the faith's foundation, the fourfold gospel, its rational foundation, namely those gospels' status as historically accurate and true because they state first-hand testimony that conveys the memories of honest eyewitnesses who either composed gospels or directly informed those who composed the gospels. Paul VI in 1973 too trustingly appointed to the revamped Pontifical Biblical Commission or to the International Theological Commission New Testament scholars who, perhaps already at least inwardly and certainly soon openly, defied or simply ignored those foundational affirmations of Dei Verbum. Raymond Brown, Pierre Grelot, Rudolf Schnackenberg, and others. John Paul II, advised by Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, did likewise. In the Catechism of the Catholic Church, first appearing in 1993, the two key sentences of Dei Verbum, the ones I have been reporting to you, have gone missing. The Catechism does reproduce elements of three sentences from Vatican I's teaching on faith and reason. There are external, that is, evidence and public reason-based proofs of revelation. The miracles and prophecies and some other signs are certain signs of revelation and are reasons for belief which show that faith's assent is not a blind movement of the mind. But missing entirely are Vatican I's affirmations that reason not only neither presupposes nor opposes faith, but actually supports the faith, indeed demonstrates its foundations, and shows that those rational foundations are extremely firm. John Paul II's encyclical on reason and faith, Fides et Ratio, in 1998, makes even fainter reference to Vatican I's teachings on the relation between reason and faith. It omits the fact that that teaching concerns, in significant part, the rational demonstrability of faith, not simply the absence of insoluble conflict between faith and reason, but also reason's strong support for faith. Amazingly, as it seems to me, Fides et Ratio does not consider at all the need and opportunity to show by reasons that God's nature and purposes have in fact been the subject matter of a historical sequence of public revelation. The encyclical's concern with reason is virtually exclusively with philosophy, and scarcely, if at all, with that supreme exercise of reason in which one enters on a philosophically sound exploration of historical evidence in order to reach a judgment about the best explanation of facts of supreme importance, the facts of divine self-disclosure in history. The encyclical's motif that reason and faith are the two wings on which the human spirit rises to contemplation of truth is thus greatly impaired by its failure to consider, so to speak, how the wings are joined. All these matters are equally or even more absent, as unsurprisingly as regrettably, from Pope Francis's encyclical taken over from Benedict XVI on faith, Lumen Fidei, in 2013. And to such omissions, leading Christian prelates have added erroneous and destructive assertions, such as those of main Catholic bishops of the German-speaking countries, who in 1979 approved a still-printed and standard ecumenical German-language edition of the New Testament, which, for example, introduces the third gospel by saying it looks back to the destruction of Jerusalem, bracket, Luke 21:20-24, and probably falls within 80 to 90 AD, unquote. This tells the Christians and inquirers of these countries that even Jesus could not perform a miracle of prophecy, and that the author of that gospel felt free in 80 to 90 to invent a prophecy of the siege and destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, and to put it on the lips of Jesus, allegedly speaking 50 or 60 years earlier. thus showing the unreliability of Luke's own opening promises to readers that his gospel would convey eyewitness testimonies in order to show the historical truth and solidity of Christian preaching about Jesus' life and teaching. Worst of all, I think that mainstream scholarly arguments that are left unstated but certainly are relied upon by those German bishops in telling their Christian people and any inquirer into Christianity that Luke and Matthew are not only late in writing but untrustworthy are not sound arguments. Their insufficiency, indeed their feebleness, has been demonstrated in the 1920s by the Catholic M.J. Lagrange, in the 1940s by the Congregationalist C.H. Dodd of my college in Oxford, and in the early 1970s by the liberal Anglican J.A.T. Robinson, and again since then. When one investigates then the bases of those mainstream positions, as I have been doing off and on when I can in the last decade, it becomes clear what the best explanation of the relevant data is. Now, by relevant data here, I mean the set that includes both the whole historical record about the foundational events of the 1st century AD and the record of the main elements of and changes in mainstream scholarly opinions in the 20th century AD. For all this whole set, the best explanation is not that the mainstream positions are true, positions entailing that Christianity's historical claims about what Jesus said and did are false. Instead, the best explanation is, first, that those historic claims are true, as Catholic and many other Christian scholars maintained and vindicated down to the Second Vatican Council, not least the prolific and masterly scholar Lucien Cerfaux, who was probably the primary drafter of Dei Verbum's statements about the Gospels, and second, that the post-Vatican II mainstream has adopted its positions for a cluster of at least 15 reasons, or at least motivations, not one of them, either alone or in combination, being valid warrant or reason for adopting one or any of the mainstream positions. And most of these motivations are at work, in varying forms, of course, in any scholarly community, undermining that community's scholarship as a search for truth, but sustaining it as a means to other ends. So let me run through my incomplete list of them. 15. First, desire to proclaim or adhere to, in this case, faith on minimal or only uncontroversial assumptions. Second, desire to occupy a via media between skepticism and fundamentalism, say. 3, desire for intellectual autonomy and openness to reason instead of subjection to authoritarian decrees or guidance. 4, awareness of pious frauds in the history of Christianity. 5, desire to be respected as a genuine scholar by competent and diligent scholars who are contemptuous of the Church's authority and often even of Christianity and even of theism, and who are academically well-placed. So mainstream peer pressure, fear of men, and this goes along with the failure to grasp that in the field of revelation and Christian origins, the aspiration to use a methodology that is acceptable to unbelieving scholars is systematically misguided, as philosophers such as Michael Dummett and Richard Swinburne and many others have pointed out. 6th, desire not to be held to the labour of harmonizing the gospel testimonies, so a relaxation of effort, a line of least resistance. 7th, desire to have new things to say. 8, denial of or skepticism about divine interventions in history. 9, confusion, sometimes by muddle bona fide, of critical methods with skeptical results, and consequent defaming as uncritical or fundamentalist of all those who reach conservative judgments, even when they do so after rigorous critical inquiry. 10, under-informed and uncritical indeed, under-researched acceptance of calumnies against the competence and integrity of earlier generations of, say, Catholic scholars and of the Council Fathers and experts. 11, indignation against excesses committed in the ecclesiastical repression of Catholic modernism between 1907 and, say, 1943 or even 1963. 12, desire to get a job or promotion in the modern academy. 13, fear of disappearing into a lifelong black hole of research on, for example, the dating and sequence of the first three Gospels, the so-called synoptic problem, the research that would be involved in vindicating one's departure from the mainstream. 14, desire for simple solutions. For example, priority of Mark appears to simplify the redaction criticism needed to identify what, on mainstream assumptions, Matthew and Luke have added editorially. And 15 in this list, distraction by the now massive historical and present reality of Catholic institutional, intellectual and spiritual life, and of theological subdisciplines, all of which makes it relatively easy, or at least made it relatively easy in the generation after Vatican II, to overlook the dependence of the whole edifice on the precise, narrow set of facts affirmed as the fundamental facts in Dei Verbum 18 and 19, and makes it still possible for Catholic audiences to hear a priest exegete talk of history as opposed to faith, and, like the bishops who give his books imprimaturs, discern no radical threat to the faith. To repeat, each of those 15 desires, fears, indignations, and other motivations is at least understandable and at best quite legitimate in itself, but none of them warrants or even begins to warrant the positions the adoption of which they psychologically support. None of them is either evidence or valid argumentation or ground for judgment. And some such disjunction between motivations and sound reasons is ever present, mutatis mutandis, in every scholarly field and discipline and community. So, for the foreseeable future, Christian scholars in every field will be unable to discern with ease and security which scholarly books to study to strengthen and deepen their own understanding of the Christian faith. They will need to apply a sort of litmus test. Does a preacher or scholar treat the foundations of the faith as they were treated in Dei Filius of Vatican I and Dei Verbum of Vatican II? And particularly in the parts of Dei Verbum that have gone missing in the Catechism, sections 18 and the last sentence of section 19. Does he or she read the Gospels in what they really are? The records of what was preached by the apostles face to face, eye to eye, to the people of Judea and Samaria in the years when Pontius Pilate was still governing Judea, and in the years up to the first execution of an apostle, James, by the puppet king Herod Agrippa, doubtless in Jerusalem in 43 or early 44 AD. That preaching, most probably based in part on notes taken in Aramaic and Hebrew during the public ministry of Jesus and his post-resurrection ministry to apostles and disciples, was most probably structured in memorizable form for partly illiterate audiences and for the other preachers soon needed throughout the diaspora. Doubtless, too, it was soon or immediately rendered into written form in both Aramaic and Hebrew and translated equally or almost equally soon into the Greek that is all that has survived. When we read those texts, we are as close to events and teachings as were the first or earlier audiences of Peter and John in the villages of Samaria, or of James, perhaps even in Spain in the decade before 43 and 44 AD, and of the other apostles as they scattered throughout the known world as far as India and China with Thomas in the 2 decades after the resurrection. There is no sufficient reason to think that John's Gospel was later than the others, and the 5 distinct parts of John that fit almost like a jigsaw with parts of Mark probably convey to us the content of the forays of Peter and John to preach and teach jointly in Jerusalem and the city and villages of Samaria in the early or mid-30s AD. This is the fourfold quadriform gospel, and it is the foundation of the faith, as Dei Verbum says, adopting the judgment of the 2nd century scholar Bishop Irenaeus of Smyrna and Lyon. Their construction adheres rigorously to two complementary principles, neither of them coherently discussed by the current mainstream. On the one hand, the account must be simplified to fit a course of memorizable evangelical preaching and quite soon an annual liturgical cycle, so a 3-year public ministry alternating mainly between Jerusalem and Galilee is presented by Matthew, Mark and Luke without chronological indicators, but just as if it involved simply 1 year with one single first and final visit to Jerusalem. John allows the historical length and complexity of the ministry to appear, while making simplifications of his own to align his gospel with the temple feasts that dominated Jewish life in Jerusalem and throughout the diaspora, and which find echoes in the Christian liturgical year. But on the other hand, secondly, while simplification can allow weeks, months, or years to pass unreported between one sentence and the next, there is never any question of invention, either of sayings or events. All corresponds to reality and must and can be harmonized as everything that is true to reality can be harmonized, because there is just one universe and one course of history. The wondrous signs done by Jesus and the apostles present no challenge to reason once we grasp, as reason invites and indeed compels, the nature of transcendent creative causality, always at work from the beginning and ever producing new things like life and consciousness and conscience, wholly unpredictable on the basis of what went before. These signs were no more and no less than was required and fitting for launching the last and supernatural phase of creation, the invitation and adoption of human persons into a divine life that will outlast the entire created universe of subpersonal realities. Not one of the miracles is more surprising than our own everyday ability to address the Creator in a prayer. Christianity is not about inwardly experienced encounter in this life, and any or every one of us may live a long life of faith without ever experiencing within our consciousness the Creator or the Lord Jesus or any of the saints we invoke, and yet have the soundest of reasons, the apostolic testimony to Jesus, for judging that our prayers are heard by the Father who sees all that we do in secret, and through his power by everyone to whom we address those prayers. So if we ask in single-hearted prayer for strength and insight and sound judgment and fearlessness in our scholarly vocation and work, we will surely receive those gifts in due measure, and may even possibly be able to surmise, at least in retrospect, something about how and in what matters they were indeed given these helps. May it be so for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we have a lot of questions, and we both have democratic elements for this discussion and authoritarian. I'm the representative of the authoritarian element, so I'll take my right and ask the first two questions, and then we'll go to what Slido says. And the first one relates to the first part of your lecture, where you talked about the good time. Why is it a good time to be a Christian scholar? And if I understood it correctly, you talked about 4 different creative pieces of information, creation of matter, creation of life, creation of human life, and salvation, perhaps, was the fourth. And then you said that the modern scientific discoveries over the course of the last 150 years somehow support this Christian revelation or this importance of information. Could you perhaps explain a little more or show us an example of the argument, how these new scientific discoveries support, and in what way support this Christian understanding of the universe?
Well,
you have to.
Yes. I mean, I referred specifically to the discoveries of physicists about matter in the early 20th century, of which philosophers and others began to be fully aware in the 1930s and 40s, but all the more aware in subsequent decades. That demolition of the common sense conception of matter, which was the foundation of every kind of materialist, atomist, pre-Socratic, early Greek philosophical, and then Enlightenment skepticism about creation at all, and the view that the universe is simply bits of these matter, bits of matter like this, which approach each other and diverge and swerve and so forth, and can be talked of in the two rather blank terms, chance and necessity, as if those explained anything, the necessity being entirely unexplained. All that was demolished by the demonstration that what we have, in fact, is something more like what I called it, processes of intense activity. I mean, the number of interactions between water molecules in the simplest cell or chemical component, chemical element, the number of interactions between water molecules is billions per fraction of a second. And yet this chaotic storm of interactions is rigorously controlled by what I called information, by a pattern which results in what we think of as the stability and solidity, etc., of matter. So so when you look, for example, at Thomas Aquinas's opponents, those against whom he's arguing for the existence of God, what he has in mind always is those materialists. And those materialists were still in many respects flourishing, and they're still flourishing today at a level of popular culture. And I think popular opinion accepts or assumes that this is the realistic picture of reality. But the truth that information is intelligible, information is the word that has come to be used, and all related words based on the analogy of language are being constantly used in biology. So it was in sort of post-60s biology that this term information, as I was using it in an extended analogical sense, came to the forefront and remains dominant in biology. And of course, biology doesn't ask and doesn't need to ask what the source of this information is. But it has now become possible to understand that source, which has, of course, many natural causes, but the whole set of causes can't be adequately thought of in terms of chance or of necessity, but speaks of design, the intelligibility of design. And so we shouldn't be afraid to speak of design. There's a great propaganda campaign against the naivety of talking of design, but this is an evasion of the truth that neither chance nor necessity, so-called, can explain this immense flexibility and complexity, diversity, but predictability.
Okay, and my second question is relating to the rational foundations of faith that you talked about, and you mentioned three, that God exists, that there was a historic revelation, and that church is a trustworthy community keeping the revelation. And I was wondering how, I guess I could kind of picture the argument for the first two, but what would be your argument, the rational argument, the demonstration for the third proposition, that the church is a trustworthy, credible community that's keeping the revelation for the last 2,000 years, right?
Well, I won't try a full demonstration, but the evidence is to be seen first and very clearly in the Gospels, in the structure of the Gospels, in the structure of Jesus' public ministry, in his formation of a group, of an inner group, of the 12, and of the replacement of the 12th after his treason by another 12th. The qualification being that this new 12th man, Matthias, should be someone who accompanied the Lord from the beginning and can speak as an eyewitness to the people. And the other evidence in the New Testament extended through the epistles of Peter and of James and of Paul extensively, that there was provision for the handing on of these responsibilities, these apostolic responsibilities, that there was the formation from the very beginning of a liturgical life, a sacramental life, of the Eucharist as the primary focus of that life, of baptism and Eucharist as the fundamental sacraments. And the responsibility of specially appointed people and appointed with the blessing of the Spirit to hand this on in a trustworthy manner. So the constant concern throughout the New Testament with trustworthiness, with credibility of testimony, with honesty, with everything that is involved in the huge project of projecting what was said and done in that 2 or 3 year ministry into the future. So the parables of our Lord about the kingdom and its growth, especially gathered in Matthew, but not only in Matthew, make no sense except on the assumption that he is envisaging this community growing from a mustard seed into a tree of great stability and size, and is projecting in every respect, from here to the end of history, a message which he himself didn't commit to writing, but trusted to his community to commit to writing and transmit. That I think is the primary element in a complex demonstration.
Sure, thanks. So let's now turn to your questions. There's one that's kind of similar to mine, so I'll start with that one. The question has 14 likes. Are you saying that it can be scientifically proven which of the revelations of the world religions is true? Why were the Jewish unable to see the historic facts pointing to Jesus as the Messiah when they were happening?
Well, scientific demonstration, the word scientific I'm happy to accept, but if it means natural scientific, of course, that's not the relevant question. We're talking about historical judgments informed by at least a philosophy that's sound enough to avoid skeptical errors of various a priori kinds. So natural science is in the wings only here. Can we demonstrate that the others are not true? Well, the primary demonstration is that this one is true, and then one can go and inspect the less. If this is true, then the expectation that there will be rival truths it becomes implausible, and so there's no urgent responsibility of any particular person to go further than judging that this one is true and try and discredit the others. That can be done, but the main demonstration is the credibility and truth of this one. Why did some of the Jewish people not accept and others of the Jewish people accept, as very many did, both in Jerusalem and in Judea, and especially around the vast diaspora, much more numerous than the populations of Judea or even Galilee, probably 3 million or so people of Hebrew descent living around the shores of the Mediterranean in that era. And many of them did come to accept, and then many did not. And why? Well, to some extent, the question is the same sort of question as arises today. Why does one person, in some respect, confronted with the evidence, accept it, and another person not? And that's, in each case, a biographical question. But one can say a little bit more, I think, probably about the historical circumstances which relate to the reception of Jesus's message and life and resurrection. And that is, when you look at the history of the Hebrew people, of the Jewish people, you find that all the prophets have this experience. Essentially, all the prophets meet intense resistance. And so when you read the records of the prophets and their own writings, much of what they're saying is about the resistance they receive. And in all these cases, the resistance is a kind of resistance to the new, to the unexpected, to the what we couldn't predict on the basis of what preceded, which, as I say, is now the picture of evolution that we have. So from the basis of physics and the first few billion years, no one would predict, of course there was no one there, but no one would predict that life could emerge, because even the simplest cell is immensely more complex than the entire universe as it existed and had existed. And similarly with the emergence of consciousness, and then finally with the emergence of an animal that can speak to God. All unexpected. So the resistance of people who are familiar with, in the case now of the Jewish people, a highly complex and, as they judged and rightly judged, partly revealed, so they came to accept slowly the message of the prophets and integrated that into their own life and liturgy, but after resistance. So when the Lord came, there was again resistance and acceptance and a complex of historical circumstances in which in some places the resistance prevailed. And then there's the destruction of the Jewish people as an organized entity only 40 years after the ascension of the Lord. And at that point, cut off from the rest of the Jewish world, the rabbis, particularly the Pharisees, reassembled, regrouped on the coast west of Jerusalem and created what we now think of as Judaism, which is in significant respects different from the Judaism of the Lord's time, and was adapted to excluding Jesus' message. Changes in the liturgy of the religion were made so as to eliminate what the Christians, those Jews who had become Christians, had found attractive. So the Ten Commandments were degraded in the liturgy, etc., because the Christians had accepted that as the part of the law that was to be carried forward into history.
A different question. How do you understand miracles? How does or can matter interact with God's information?
Well, it does nothing but interact with God's information. God's information is being supplied all the time. Traditionally, this was thought of as providential sustaining of the universe, which was once simply created and then creation finished. That, I think, is an oversimplification. And even that traditional picture, as for example in St. Thomas, accepts creation of the individual human soul in each case. So there's God's information, which is essentially what soul is. It's information dominating what it was is simply matter. The phrase soul and body is systematically misleading. There is no body except an ensouled parcel of matter. Without the soul, what we call body is not in fact a body, it's a corpse, it's a heap of matter, which is in fact not a body. So a miracle is a kind of special example of the general case. And the general case itself includes these specializations, these novelties, these steps up. So each of those was, as I said, a kind of miracle relative to what went before. And a miracle, as we speak of the miracles of the New Testament, is a one-off, a local sign, useful for teaching, exemplifying on a single occasion the kind of dominance of matter that is exemplified in every second of our life.
And how do you define information? What exactly? Because it seems to me that you're using it, well, in many different contexts, right?
Yeah. It is essentially the old concept of form. It's the Aristotelian concept of form. It's what gives intelligibility to everything that is intelligible. That's got a pattern. That's got a shape. That's got a process that is not simply random. That's information. It's what, as it were, guides this element to move in that way such that together all these elements, billions of them in any second, in any cell, etc., constitute a stable but dynamic, diversifying, self-sustaining, in the case of living entities, system. So where we can talk of system, where we can talk of pattern, then we must be able to talk of information.
More maybe personal or social question. Are Catholic or Christian scholars welcome in the universities and colleges in the West? And if not, what should they do?
Yes, in most places they still are. In increasingly many cases, it's on condition that they remain quiet about some of their beliefs, some of their judgments, some of the truths that they hold. I had a lifetime of scholarship in a central place in the European system, and I found no serious resistance. I was appointed and promoted by unbelievers, but who were good liberals and respected the flow of investigation and inquiry, whoever was conducting it. That kind of, you might say, old-fashioned liberalism is not as securely in position as it was when I began, or even as it was 10 or 15 years ago. It still is the official ethos of everywhere, but rapidly being undermined in many places by the demands of movements of thought, which in some respects started at a very high level in our culture, that presume, or which assert, that any kind of criticism on certain matters is to be taken as an expression of contempt for the person, and is therefore harmful to the persons whose actions or opinions are under criticism. Now, once that false thesis becomes widely accepted, the conditions of old liberal acceptance of a diversity of opinions and of freedom of speech and of teaching and so forth becomes almost impossible. And so there's a struggle going on within Western institutions, and some are surviving and some are not surviving so well.
How is Oxford doing in this respect?
Well, it varies. It's certainly subject to these pressures. It's not as subject as some places, but it has its difficulties.
The recent treatment of Roger Scruton shows that Christian scholars are losing the culture war of free will versus determinism. Can this be reversed, and how?
There's no recipe. Everything can be reversed. Whether everything will be reversed, whether anything will be reversed, is a matter of predicting the future. And I haven't got the relevant white ball for doing it. Perhaps someone has. I don't, and I don't think anyone has. No, history is full of contingencies and suppressions. The history of Christianity is a history of constant collapses and suppressions and deviations and explosions, which you'd think were the end of it, and yet it has brought itself together again in a reduced or perhaps a not reduced, an enhanced form, and carries on. The future is not for prediction. It's nothing like a natural scientific process. It's all subject to freedom. It's subject, therefore, to grace and to malice and to every kind of negligence and everything in between.
I should remind everyone that we also have an opportunity to ask a question outside of Slido, takže keď sa chcete niekto opýtať cez mikrofón, vraj tu je tá možnosť, tak môžete sa pripraviť, ak niekto chce zdvihnúť ruku. Zatiaľ položím ďalšiu otázku. Another kind of practical question, how should we fight the society which marks us, or Christian scholars, as bigots?
Well, the primary solution, so to speak, the course of action that I recommend is the one I implicitly was proposing and defending throughout, namely that you should be a good scholar. You should be of the best as within your powers. You should be really honest. You should be really careful. You should be scrupulous in handling and deeply inquiring in what you investigate and publish clean and clear and so forth and so forth. And resist every kind of seduction and blandishment and pressure. And thus prove the compatibility and more than compatibility of Christian faith with science and knowledge and scholarship. And as I say, it's intrinsically wholly possible and nothing but extrinsic obstacles could be in the way of it. So if you are dismissed in some place, then you can, if you can, pick yourself up and go to another place. That's easily said by someone who didn't really have any problem, serious opposition throughout. That was my good fortune. It was the good circumstances I found myself in, not special merits of me by any means. No, the opposition wasn't there, but the opposition is in real places, and I'm not in any way minimizing the difficulties. But that's the only solution that I have to recommend. Be of the highest quality and integrity.
You're saying that you didn't have any opposition, but I mean, I know you've had a lot of oppositions.
No more opposition than I was making to my colleagues. I mean, I was opposing their ideas; they were opposing mine. That's not the kind of opposition that represents.
But even like in a universal, more university system or academic world, when your views on certain moral issues you made public and fought in the intellectual battles on those issues, did you not find that perhaps you were not welcome in some circles or others?
Yes, as from the 1990s. Certain kinds of audience were no longer willing to invite me because of my views about abortion. And then soon after that, because of my views on homosexuality, etc., all that. And it's only very recently that kind of opposition has become, as it were, aggressive rather than simply passively unwillingness to invite.
Okay. Anyone has a question in the audience? Máme otázku? Tam vzadu, slečna? Skúste, ja sa to pokúsim preložiť, ak sa mi to podarí.
Dobrý deň, Sonia Hergotová. Chcem sa opýtať jednu vec. Ježiš prišiel na svet, aby vrátil človeku dokonalú prírodzenosť, ktorú človek mal, keď bol v raji a Boha zradil. Proste odkazujem na mýtus od Adamovi a Eve. Chcem sa opýtať, ako pán profesor odpovedá na túto vec v konfrontácii s Darwinovou evolúciou. Ak prejdeme Darwinovú evolúciu od začiatku do konca, nájdeme tam nejaký stav dokonalej prírodzenosti človeka? Ďakujem.
The question is if Jesus came to bring back the original state of the perfect human nature, and then there's Darwin's theory of evolution, and whether you think that somewhere in that theory of evolution there is a space for this perfect state of human nature.
Yes, that's a very interesting and important question, which I'm actively studying along with some friends at the moment. I think, and a number of other important faithful Christians, Catholics, think that the perfection spoken of in relation to what Genesis 2 and 3 calls Adam, which certainly in the context means the human man. It's simply it occurs hundreds and hundreds of times throughout the Old Testament, simply meaning man. It's a collective noun. At a certain point, the Greek translation of what presumably was the underlying Hebrew shifts, well, which certainly was the underlying Hebrew, shifts to, and this happened in probably the 2nd century BC, shifts to speaking of Adam as an individual. And so the assumption is made, well, there was this one perfect individual. But I think the meaning of the whole account given in Genesis 2 and 3, when reconsidered in the light of what we should not call Darwinian evolution. Evolution is, in my view, a fact. Darwinian evolution is by far the least plausible explanation of evolution. Darwinian evolution, for example, is regarded by virtually no French scientist as anything other than absurd. Because what's called Darwinian evolution is the theory that nothing but chance, in response to nothing but chance mutations, is the guiding principle which carries evolution from this position to that position. And that's extremely improbable. And the whole account that I've been giving of information is one that makes Darwinian accounts of evolution implausible. But leave aside Darwinianism, and so there's the fact of evolution. Now, in that light, we look again at the text of Genesis 2 and 3, and we see all sorts of complexity. It's obvious that the author of the text did not intend each and every detail of the account to be a description of what happened in some garden with the Lord walking in the garden and so forth, and of these 4 rivers coming out of the garden and so forth. It's quite clear that this was conceived as what in Hebrew is a mashal. It gets translated into Greek as a parable. Now, a parable doesn't mean non-historical. So our Lord's parable of the tenants in the vineyard, which is a vast parable of the history of the prophets and of the coming of the prophets and the rejection of the prophets, and a kind of prophecy cum history of his own arrival as the son of the owner of the vineyard, etc. So there's history being recounted, but in a parable, what's clearly a parable. And I think that's the case with Genesis 2 and 3. And then it's easy to see that the perfection being spoken of, take one part of it, immortality. Was Adam immortal? Well, in the account, Adam never, and nor does Eve, take from the tree of life. And the Lord at the end says, well, I'm going to bar them from paradise, from the garden, lest they, unless, so that they won't eat from the tree of life and become immortal. And so the story, it's the account, the parable, the mashal itself tells us that these first human beings, and there must have been a first, there must have been a first human being who spoke to the Lord or was communicated to by the Lord. This first human being did not have the gift of immortality, was not perfect in that respect, but was destined to be, and rejected that destiny. So there was a promise, but there was the conditions for the fulfillment of the promise were never fulfilled. Instead, there was a rejection of the offer. And so one can go through the other features of what St. Thomas calls a set of perfections of Adam. St. Thomas had a vision in interpreting the whole biblical account. St. Thomas was thinking in terms that are simply now disqualified. He thought that we could find the Garden of Eden if more exploration were done, and that it's somewhere over there in the east, but in a part that hasn't been discovered yet. Now, we know that that's not true. And so much that St. Thomas says is simply based on lack of historical information. I think the truth of the account is both historical and prophetic, and the larger part of it is the prophecy of perfection at the end, and the availability of that perfection in the sharing of life with the Lord, with God in eternity.
Thanks.
The tree of life then is the symbol of that promise.
We have many more questions. I know there are many people who want to ask a question, but we only have 1 more minute left. And I think there's one here, a philosophical question that is appropriate for ending this talk tonight. And that is, what is, an easy question, what is the most convincing argument for the existence of God?
Well, St. Thomas, having given in the book, the Summa Theologiae for beginners in theology, he gives 5 proofs. In other works of his, he gives another dozen. Having given the 5, he says it's the first and the 5th that are found most convincing by ordinary people. And I'm not going to reproduce either of them. I've done so in my book, Aquinas, which I commend to you. So in the last chapter, I go through these proofs. I show their soundness in a straightforward, simple manner, which is in which St. Thomas's own historically dated and now inapplicable natural science is replaced by our understanding of natural science. But the first relates to the impossibility of explaining not so much physical motion like a billiard ball or such like mechanical motion of that kind, but explaining the whole shift of any active being from a potentiality to the fulfillment of the potentiality without there being something to explain that shift from one state to another state of being to another state of being. And whether you extend that explanation to infinity in one dimension, the whole set remains without explanation unless we have a state of actuality which isn't in movement from potentiality to actuality, but is pure act. And the 5th simply relates to the intelligibility of the whole deal, of everything that we can see, has this astounding intelligibility that talk of chance and of necessity simply doesn't begin to handle.
Easy. I wish I had words to express the joy and gratitude, not only for your presence here with us this week, but also for your life and your life's work. Thank you very much, Professor Finnis. Thank you all.